The Tale of Peter Rabbit. Peter lived with his family in a sandbank under the roots of a big fir tree. He was always a problem for his mother, causing trouble and getting into scrapes. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put into a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into any mischief. I am going out." Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail went down the lane to gather blackberries, but Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes, and then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley, but round the end of the cucumber frame, who should he meet but Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Beatrix Potter. Now your job today is to read this story 3 times. You need to read it once in your head, once out loud, and once to somebody else in your house. And then you're going to answer these questions. So these first ones are really easy. You just need one answer. We've got question 1, which says, Mrs. Rabbit told her children they must not something. Question 2, Flopsy, Mopsy and Cottontail went to gather something. Question 3, Peter got into Mr. McGregor's garden by something. And question 4, when Mr. McGregor saw Peter, he something. So your job is just to look through the text and figure out what the answers to these questions are. Now some might have one word and some might be a phrase or a few words that you need to find and copy. Then when we get on to more to think about, there's a little bit more thinking that needs to go into them. So if we have a look at question 1 first, it says, write a sentence to answer each question. So we know a sentence needs 4 things. We need to make sure it has a capital letter, a full stop, finger spaces, and it needs to make sense. So if it doesn't have those 4 things, it's not a sentence, it's just a phrase. Now 1A says, what happened to Peter Rabbit? So your job is to look through the text and read really carefully and find out what happened to Mr. Rabbit, and then you're going to write it into a sentence. 1B says, what did Peter eat in the garden? 1C says, what was Mr. McGregor doing in the garden? And 1D says, why did Mr. McGregor call Peter a thief? So remember, each of these questions needs a whole sentence, and those 4 things we need one more time. We need a capital letter, finger spaces, a full stop, and they need to make sense. Question 2 is looking at synonyms, and remember, a synonym is just a different word that means the same as the word we've got. So it says, copy these words from the story, then next to each write another word the writer could have used. One has been done to help you. So you can see, 2A, the word in the text is mischief, and it's told us that another word for mischief is trouble. Now 2B, we need to think of another word for naughty, 2C, another word for gather, and 2D, another word for squeezed. And some of these words are quite tricky, so if you're having trouble, you could always look in a thesaurus, or as long as your grown-up is there with you, have a look on a website called thesaurus.com, and that will tell you different words for each of these words. And when you finish that, there are 2 last questions to do on the Now Try These section. Question 1 says, in your book, write what Mr. McGregor might have said to his wife when he went in for his tea. So you need to think really carefully about what's happened in the story and what Mr. McGregor might tell his wife when he goes in. What's he going to talk about? What things happened in the garden? Who did he see? Those are the things that you're going to include, and write 4 or 5 sentences about the things he tells her about his time in the garden. And then the trickiest question of all is this last one here, and it says, do you think Peter escaped from the garden? Now that part is not too tricky. That's just a yes or a no answer, and we'll all have different answers because it's opinion. So some of us might think he did escape, some of us think maybe he didn't escape. But here is where it gets a bit tricky, because now you are going to be the author. So Beatrix Potter has started off the story, and you're going to finish it. You're going to write some paragraphs telling the reader how the story ends. So think carefully about what Mrs. Rabbit warned Peter about and what happened to Peter's father. Think carefully about how Mr. McGregor looks and if you think he could catch the rabbit and the mischief that Peter might be getting up to. Think carefully about all of those things and then write a few paragraphs to end the story in whichever way you think would be the best possible ending. But don't forget, just like in these questions here, you're going to need capital letters, finger spaces, full stops, and it needs to make sense. Now, your chili challenge today, if you're looking for an extra challenge, something to stretch you even further and be really aspirational, your chili challenge is going to be to record yourself reading the ending that you've written and uploading it to Dojo. I would love to see lots of videos.